The rain had been falling on Hollowmere for 2 days when Saoirse heard the whimper at her door. She had been kneeling at the hearth, coaxing a stubborn fire from damp wood, her hands stained dark with the resin of pine kindling. The cottage smelled of wet stone and the lavender she had hung in bunches from the rafters. And outside, the wind moved through the orchard like something alive, dragging the bare branches against her shutters in a slow, scraping rhythm that had kept her awake for 3 nights running. She did not hear footsteps. She did not hear breathing. She heard only the small, broken sound, no louder than a child's hiccup, and yet it reached her through the storm as if it had been spoken directly into her ear. Saoirse stilled. For a long moment she did not move. The cottage at the edge of the Hollowmere Wood was the last dwelling on the eastern road, and no traveler in their right mind would be on that road in this weather. The nearest village lay 3 miles to the west, and even the boldest poachers stayed home when the rain came down like this, slate gray and ceaseless, soaking the moss until the forest floor swallowed the sound of footsteps. The whimper came again. Closer now. Lower. Saoirse rose slowly, the iron poker still in her hand. She had not survived 2 years of hiding by being careless. She had not built a life in a forgotten village under a borrowed name by opening doors to strangers in the middle of storms. Her hand trembled as she crossed the small room, and she pressed her palm flat against the wood to steady herself before she lifted the latch. She did not open the door fully. She opened it only the width of her own shoulder, just enough to see what lay on her threshold. A pup, not a dog. She knew the difference at a single glance. The shape of the skull was wrong, the legs too long for the body, the ears too sharp, the chest too deep. A wolf pup, small but no longer newborn, soaked through to the skin and shivering so violently that its small ribs seemed to vibrate. Its fur, where she could see it beneath the mud, was the color of moonlight on river ice. Pale, almost silver, almost luminous. It looked up at her with eyes that did not belong in the head of an animal. They were the color of old honey held to a candle flame, and they were aware. Not the alert wariness of a wild creature. Awareness. The kind that recognized her, weighed her, decided about her. Saoirse's breath caught. For a heartbeat she stood frozen, and the pup did not move either, and the rain hammered down between them like a curtain that neither of them was willing to be the first to part. Then a gust of wind drove a sheet of water sideways across the threshold, and the pup flinched, and the spell broke. She did not think. She reached down and gathered the small, sodden creature into her arms. It was lighter than she expected, lighter than the rabbits she set traps for in the autumn. She could feel every bone in its body pressing against her wrists, and she knew at once that this animal had not eaten in days. Whatever it had run from, whatever it had crossed, the journey had nearly killed it. Saoirse closed the door against the storm. She knelt before her hearth and laid the pup on the flagstones near the fire, and she began to work with the quick, practiced hands of someone who had learned the body of every creature in the forest before she had learned to write her own name. She stripped off her shawl and wrapped the pup in the dry wool. She worked the worst of the mud free with a soft cloth. She held a tin cup of warmed broth to its mouth, drop by patient drop, until the pup found the strength to lap weakly at the rim. All the while, the honey-colored eyes watched her. "You are far from where you belong," she murmured, and her voice was low and steady, the voice she used for frightened animals and frightened children. "I know that look. I have worn it myself." The pup made a small sound, almost a sigh, and pressed its damp nose into the crook of her elbow. Saoirse did not let herself look at it for too long. She had spent 2 years training herself not to look at things too long, not to want things, not to grow attached to anything she might one day be forced to leave behind. The cottage was rented. The herbs in her garden were not truly hers. The cat who slept on her windowsill belonged to the miller's wife. Even her name, the one the villagers used, was not the name her mother had given her. Her real name lived only inside her chest, and she said it to no one. She set the cup aside and rocked back on her heels, pressing her wrists against her eyes for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. When she lowered her hands, the pup had crawled closer to the fire and was watching her with that same impossible attentiveness, and she felt her resolve crack like ice over deep water. "Just for tonight," she said softly. "Just until the storm passes. Then I will find someone to take you home." The pup did not blink. Saoirse turned away and began to busy herself with the kettle. She did not see the way the pup's gaze drifted past her shoulder to the door. She did not see the way its small ears pricked forward, as if it were listening to something far beyond the reach of human ears. She did not see the way its tail, when it twitched in a rhythm that was almost a code, almost a signal, almost a call. She did not see, but the pup heard. 3 miles away, on a ridge above the storm-blackened valley, a man stood in the rain without a cloak and lifted his face to the sky. He had been tracking for 4 days. 4 days without sleep. 4 days during which he had said almost nothing aloud, because every word that left his mouth came out shaped like a growl, and his men had learned to keep their distance when the silence in him grew that deep. They followed him still. They would follow him into the sea if he commanded it. But they did not speak to him. They did not meet his eyes. They did not look at the place at his throat where his collar gaped open and revealed the old, ragged scar that ran from his jaw to his collarbone, the scar that the southern bards had begun to write songs about, the scar that the mothers in 3 kingdoms used to frighten their children into silence. "Sleep, little one, or the black wolf will hear you. Sleep, or he will come down from the mountain, and he will have your name." His name was Caelan Vareth of the Drowned Crown, and he had not slept since his son was taken. The trail had gone cold at the river, then warm again at the chapel ruins, then cold at the crossroads. He had ridden his men nearly to ruin chasing a scent that kept slipping sideways, and twice he had lifted his head to the wind and felt nothing, and twice he had nearly dropped to his knees in the wet earth and wept, because a father who could not feel his own child through the bond was a father who feared he was already too late. But tonight, at last, the wind had shifted. Tonight he could feel it. Faint as a candle seen through fog, faint as a heartbeat heard through stone. But there. A small living thread pulled taut between his ribs and some distant point in the storm-soaked dark, and he turned his face toward it the way a drowning man turns toward air. Northwest, past the salt marshes, past the orchard road, past the little village where the apothecary lived, the one the locals called the Quiet Woman, the one no one knew anything about. Caelan closed his eyes. He could not yet smell his son. The rain was too thick, the wind too wild. But he could feel him, alive, sheltered, warm, held in someone's arms. A growl began low in his chest, the kind of growl that did not belong to a man at all, and behind him on the ridge, his beta took a careful step backward and did not speak. Caelan opened his eyes, and the gold in them burned through the rain. "Move," he said, and the riders moved. Inside the cottage at the edge of the Hollowmere Wood, Saoirse banked the fire and spread her cloak over the pup as a second blanket. She blew out the lamp. She lay down on the narrow bed by the wall, and she listened to the rain. She did not know that on a ridge 3 miles away, a man with gold-burning eyes had just turned his horse toward her door. She did not know that the small creature breathing softly by her hearth was not lost at all. She did not know that he had been brought to her by a thread older than the storm, older than the wood, older than the borrowed name she lived under. A thread that even she, with all her hiding, had never managed to cut. She closed her eyes. The pup, by the fire, did not close his. He watched the door. He waited. The pup was still there when she woke. That, more than anything, was what undid her. Saoirse had been so certain in that thin gray hour before dawn when she finally slept that the small creature would be gone by morning. She had been certain because that was the rhythm of her life. Things came to her doorstep and things left it, and she had taught herself not to grieve the leaving. The wounded fox she had splinted last spring had vanished into the brambles the moment she opened the door. The crow with the broken wing had flown off without a backward glance. Even the children she healed in the village were carried home by their mothers, and she watched them go from her window and did not let herself wave. But the pup was still there. He had moved closer to her bed in the night. He lay on the bare floor at the foot of it, his small chin resting on his paws, and when she opened her eyes, he opened his, and they regarded each other through the half-light without surprise on either side, as if they had agreed in some unspoken way to keep this watch together. "Stubborn thing," she whispered. His tail thumped once against the floor. Saoirse rose and went about her morning without looking at him too directly, the way she had learned to move through her life without looking at the things that might break her if she stared. She drew water from the rain barrel, which was full to overflowing. She set the kettle on the hook above the rebuilt fire. She ground oats in the small stone mortar her grandmother had given her, the only object in the cottage that truly belonged to her, and she boiled them with a knot of butter and a pinch of salt, and divided the porridge between 2 wooden bowls. She set one bowl on the floor. The pup looked at it, then at her, then at the bowl again. He approached it with the wary delicacy of a creature who had been beaten for eating before, and Saoirse felt something tighten low in her throat, because she knew that look too. She had worn it herself, in another life, when she had been hungry and had not been certain whether the food in front of her was a gift or a trap. "Eat," she said quietly. "It is yours." He ate. He ate slowly at first, then faster, and when the bowl was empty he licked it clean and then licked the floor around it, and Saoirse pressed her hand against her mouth and turned away, too busy herself with the kettle, because the sight of a half-starved animal trusting her was not something she could bear to watch directly this early in the morning. When she turned back, he was sitting at her feet. He was looking up at her, and the honey-colored eyes were again far too aware. Saoirse knelt slowly. She held out her hand, palm up, the way she had been taught as a child to greet animals you did not know. The pup did not sniff her palm. He pressed the flat of his small head into it, as if he had been waiting his entire short life for the exact weight and warmth of that touch. She did not mean to cry. She pressed her forehead briefly against his, and she breathed in the scent of him, which was the scent of pine smoke and rain and something else. Something faintly metallic, like cold iron and old gold mixed together. It was not the scent of any animal she knew. It was not the scent of the forest. It was the scent of a place she had once lived, and a man she had once loved, and a life she had buried under 2 years of borrowed names. Saoirse pulled back as if she had been burned. "No," she said. The pup tilted his head. "No," she said again, more firmly to herself, to him, to the air. "It is not possible. You are astray. You wandered down from the high country. You smell like the forest because you have been in the forest. That is all." She stood. She turned away. She began to gather the empty bowls with hands that were not quite steady, and she told herself that she was being a fool, that grief and exhaustion were making her see ghosts in a frightened animal, that the scent she had imagined was nothing more than her own memory leaking through the walls she had spent 2 years building. She had nearly convinced herself when the knock came at the door. 3 knocks, slow, heavy, spaced exactly evenly. The kind of knock that did not ask permission so much as announce that it expected to be answered. The pup made a small sound. Not a whimper this time. Something else. Something almost like recognition, swallowed back, held in the throat. Saoirse went very still. The cottage had 2 doors, the front and the back, and the back door opened onto a footpath that curved through the herb garden and into the wood. She had run that path in her head 1,000 times in the past 2 years, rehearsing the route the way a soldier rehearses a retreat. She knew exactly how many steps it took to reach the trees. She knew which boards in the path creaked. She knew where she had buried the small leather purse with 3 silver coins and a forged letter of passage, in case the day ever came when she had to leave Hollowmere with nothing but the dress on her back. The day, she realized, had perhaps just come. The knock sounded again. The same 3 measured strikes. Circe's hand moved toward the iron poker beside the hearth. The pup, on the floor, watched her with eyes that had lost all sleepiness and were now terrifyingly calm. Mistress. The voice on the other side of the door was male, low, courteous in a way that was somehow worse than rudeness, because courtesy at her door at this hour meant someone had practiced what they were going to say. Forgive the early hour. I have come on behalf of my lord. We are searching for something that has been lost. We were told by the miller in the village that you live alone, at the edge of the wood, and that strange things sometimes wander to your threshold. Circe closed her eyes. The miller. Of course. The miller, who took her honey at fair prices, who had once helped her mend a broken shutter, who had no idea that telling a stranger where she lived might cost her everything. I have nothing of value here, she said through the door. Her voice came out steadier than she had expected. If your lord has lost livestock, the herders to the west would know better than I. It is not livestock, the voice said. May we come in, mistress? My lord prefers not to wait in the rain. My lord. The 2 words hit her like a hand laid suddenly against her chest. She could not have said why. Lord was a common enough word in this part of the country, where every petty landowner with 2 horses and a wall around his house called himself one. But the voice had said the word with a particular weight, the way a man speaks of someone whose anger he has personally seen, and Circe felt her stomach turn cold in a way that had nothing to do with the morning chill. What lord? She heard herself ask. There was a pause on the other side of the door. A long one. Open the door, mistress, said the voice, still courteous, still terrible. Please. The pup, at her feet, had risen. He was not afraid. That was what struck her, with a sudden and dreadful clarity. He was not afraid of whatever stood on the other side of her door. He had risen the way a child rises when he hears the voice of someone he has been waiting for, and his tail, his whole small silver body, was vibrating with a tension that was not fear but its precise opposite, recognition. Circe looked down at him, and she understood in a single breaking instant that she had been wrong about everything. The pup had not wandered to her door. The pup had not been lost in the storm. The pup had been guided. By scent or by blood or by some older thread she could not name, he had come to her cottage, and the man on the other side of the door had followed him. Her hands had gone numb. Who, she said, and her voice cracked on the word, is your lord? Another pause. Then a different voice answered. Not the courteous one. A voice deeper, rougher, lower, the kind of voice that did not belong on the other side of a cottage door at all. The kind of voice that belonged in the throats of large predators when they have decided to speak. Open the door, it said, and find out. Circe's knees nearly gave way. She knew that voice. She had not heard it in 2 years and 7 months and 11 days, and she had heard it in her dreams every single one of those nights, and she would have known it if she had been deaf in both ears and lying at the bottom of a well. She had known it the moment it spoke. She had perhaps known it from the first knock, and refused herself the knowledge. The pup, at her feet, made a soft sound that was almost a cry. And then he did something that turned the last of Circe's strength to water. He reached up with one small paw and scratched at the door. Not to be let out. To be let in. Circe stared down at the pup, at the silver fur, at the honey eyes, at the way he was leaning toward the wood of the door now, Every line of his small body bent toward the man on the other side as if pulled by a magnet, and she finally let herself complete the thought she had been refusing since the moment she had lifted him out of the rain. The scent, the eyes, the bones of him. He was Kaylin's. He was Kaylin's son. And the man at her door had not come for a stray. He had come for both of them. Saoirse lifted her hand to the latch. Her fingers were shaking so hard that she could not, at first, make them close around the iron. She breathed in once. She breathed out. She set her shoulders the way her grandmother had taught her to set them, the way a woman sets her shoulders when she is about to walk into the worst hour of her life and knows she must walk into it standing. She opened the door. Kaelin Vareth of the Drowned Crown stood on her threshold in the rain, and he was looking at her as if he had just seen a ghost rise from a grave he had dug with his own hands. He did not move. He stood in the doorway with the rain running off the black wool of his cloak in long silver lines, and he looked at her, and he did not speak, and he did not move. And Saoirse understood, in the long and terrible silence that followed, that he was holding himself as still as he was, because he did not trust what he would do if he moved. She had forgotten how tall he was. That was a foolish thing to think, in such a moment, and yet it was the first thought that came to her, sharp and useless. She had forgotten the breadth of his shoulders, the way he had to bend his head slightly to enter through any door not built for him. She had forgotten the particular stillness of him, which was not the stillness of calm, but the stillness of a creature that has chosen, for the moment, not to strike. She had forgotten the scar. The scar was new. It ran from the line of his jaw down into the open collar of his shirt, a pale and ragged thing, the kind of wound that had been left to heal without proper stitching, the kind of wound a man took when he no longer cared whether he lived. She had not given him that scar. The world had given him that scar in the years she had been gone, and the sight of it cut her in a place she had thought long since cauterized. Behind him, on the muddy track, 3 riders sat motionless on their horses, cloaked, hooded, saying nothing. Their hands were on their reins and not on their weapons, and somehow that was worse, because it meant that whatever was about to happen on her doorstep had been judged not to require their intervention. The pup pushed past her legs. Saoirse felt the small silver body slip between her ankles before she could stop it, and the pup crossed the threshold into the rain and went directly to Kaelin and pressed his head into the man's boot and stayed there, trembling, the way a child clings to a leg after a long absence and a longer fear. Kaelin looked down. For a single unguarded heartbeat, Saoirse saw the man behind the legend break. His face did something she had no name for. The muscles around his mouth pulled tight, and his eyes, which had been fixed on her with that terrible, unblinking intensity, dropped to the small creature at his feet, and a sound came out of him that was not a word at all. It was the sound a man makes when he has been holding his breath for 4 days and has only just been told he is allowed to let it out. He went down on one knee in the mud. He did not bend. He fell. The way a tree falls when the last fiber finally parts. His knee hit the wet ground with a force that should have hurt him, and he did not seem to feel it. And his hands, those enormous and capable hands that Saoirse had watched break a man's wrist with a single squeeze, came up and cupped the small, wet head of the pup with a tenderness she had only ever seen him show to one other living creature in the world. That creature had been her. "There you are," Kaelin said. His voice was wrecked. The pup made a high sound, almost a cry, and pressed himself against the broad chest, and Kaelin gathered him in and held him with both arms, and bowed his head over the small silver body. And for a long moment the most feared man in 3 kingdoms simply knelt in the rain on a peasant woman's threshold and shook. Saoirse had to put her hand on the doorframe to keep standing. She had imagined, over the years, what it would be like to see him again. She had built whole nights out of the imagining. She had pictured him cold. She had pictured him cruel. She had pictured him not recognizing her, looking past her, walking through her like a stranger passes through smoke. She had never, in any of those imaginings, pictured him on his knees. She had never pictured him weeping. When he finally lifted his head, his face was wet, and she could not tell what was rain and what was not, and she suspected he could not tell either. "You found him?" he said. She could not answer. "You found him." He said it again, quieter, as if he were trying to make the words real by saying them twice. "He was in the woods for 9 days. We thought him dead. The trackers said no pup of that age could survive 9 days in the high country alone, and I did not believe them. But every hour that passed I believed them a little more, and then last night the wind shifted, and I felt him, and I rode, and I came here, and you." He stopped. He looked at her. He looked at her, properly, for the first time since she had opened the door, and Saoirse watched the recognition arrive in his face, the way she had watched a winter sunrise once arrive in a frozen valley, slow and pale and devastating. "Saoirse," he said. It was not the name the village knew her by. It was the name he had whispered into her hair on a summer night before the world had broken, and to hear it spoken aloud, here, on this threshold, by this man, after 2 years of silence, was very nearly more than she could bear. She closed her eyes. "You are alive," he said. "Kaelin." It was the only word she could manage. It came out of her like something dragged from the bottom of a deep well, and it was the first time she had spoken his name aloud since the morning she had run. He did not stand. He stayed there, kneeling in the mud with his son in his arms, and he looked up at her with an expression that no song of the Black Wolf had ever prepared the world for, and Saoirse thought, with a clarity that frightened her, "They have him wrong. They have him entirely wrong. They do not know him at all." And then a second thought came, on the heels of the first, and it was colder. Neither did I, because the pup in his arms was not just any pup. The pup was a child, a shifter child, his child, and she had no memory of bearing such a child, no memory of giving birth, no memory of carrying any pregnancy to term, and the timing did not work, and the math did not work, and every certainty she had built her exile on was suddenly turning to sand under her feet. She had run from him because of what he had done. She had not run pregnant. The pup pressed against Kaelin's neck was not her son. He was somebody else's. Saoirse felt the world tilt sideways. She felt her hand slip from the doorframe. She felt one of her knees buckle, and she would have gone down, had not Kaelin moved with the impossible speed she remembered from another life, rising and crossing the threshold and catching her against his chest before she struck the floor. The pup was crushed gently between them. She could feel the small heartbeat against her ribs. She could feel Kaelin's heartbeat against her shoulder. She could feel the rain soaking through her dress where his cloak pressed against her, and underneath all of it, like a second pulse beneath her own, she could feel the old mark on the back of her left shoulder begin, slowly and unmistakably, to burn. She had thought that burning gone forever. She had thought she had killed it the night she ran. "Let me go," she whispered. "No." The word was soft, almost gentle, and absolute. "Kaelin, please, whatever you have come for, take him and go. I do not know what you think happened here. I sheltered the pup from the storm, that is all. I do not know him. I do not know who his mother is. I am no part of this." Kaelin did not loosen his grip. He looked down at her. His face was very close. The gold in his eyes was banked low, the way a great fire banks itself for the night, and she could see in them the man she had loved and the man she had fled, and a third man she did not yet recognize, standing somewhere behind the other two, watching her with a patience that was new. "Saoirse," he said, very quietly, "whose son do you think this is?" She could not answer. He waited. He was a man who could wait. He had waited 4 days in the rain, and he had waited 2 years for word of her, and he could wait one more breath for her to find her tongue. "He is yours," she finally managed. "You know he is yours. The eyes. The scent. He is yours, Kaylin." "Yes." "Then take him." "He is mine," Kaylin said. His voice did not rise. It only deepened, the way the river deepens after rain. "And he is yours." The cottage went silent. Even the rain seemed to fall more quietly for a moment, as if the storm itself had paused to listen. Saoirse stared up at him. "That is not possible," she whispered. "It is. I would know. Kaylin, I would know. A woman knows when she carries a child. A woman knows when she gives birth. I never—" Her voice broke. "I never had a child. I would have known." "Yes," he said. "You would have, unless someone made very sure that you would not." The mark on her shoulder flared. The pup, between them, lifted his small head and looked from one face to the other, his honey eyes wide and old and terribly, terribly knowing, as if he had heard this conversation before, somewhere, in a place none of them were yet willing to speak about. Outside, on the muddy track, one of the silent riders shifted in his saddle. He turned his head sharply toward the eastern road, the way a hound turns when it hears something the rest of the pack has not yet caught. He lifted his hand. The other two riders went still. Kaylin, inside the doorway, felt the change before he heard the warning. His head came up. His eyes, when they met the riders across the rain-swept yard, went the color of a forge. "How many?" he said. The rider held up 4 fingers, then 5. Then slowly, 6. Kaylin's arm tightened around Saoirse, and the small pup between them began, for the first time since he had been pulled from the storm, to growl. "They followed you," Saoirse breathed. "No," Kaylin said. He was already moving, drawing her back from the threshold, pulling the door shut behind them with his shoulder, his free hand finding the long knife at his belt with the unthinking certainty of a man who had drawn it 10,000 times. They followed him, and that means they have known all along exactly where he was. Saoirse looked down at the pup in his arms, at the silver fur, at the honey eyes, at the child she had sheltered from the rain, who was somehow her son, whom she had no memory of bearing, whom strangers had been hunting through 9 days of wilderness, and who had walked, on his own small legs, to her exact door. The mark on her shoulder burned like a brand, and outside, in the orchard road, the first hooded rider came into view. Kaylin moved her. That was the simplest way to describe what happened in the next handful of seconds. He did not ask. He did not explain. One of his arms was already around her, and the other was around the pup, and with a single fluid motion he turned them both away from the door and set them behind him, and Saoirse found herself standing inside her own cottage with the broad black wall of his back between her body and whatever was riding up the orchard road. "Ronan," he said. The name was not loud. It did not need to be. The courteous voice from earlier answered at once from beyond the closed door. "My king." "6 on the road. Hooded. Take Ferris and circle behind the apple trees. Quiet work. I want one of them alive." "And the others, my king?" "Take them down quietly." There was no answer. Saoirse did not hear hooves move. She did not hear footsteps. She heard only the particular quality of silence that follows a command given to men who have been trained never to repeat it back. And she understood that 2 of the riders in her yard had simply ceased to be in her yard, the way smoke ceases to be smoke when the wind takes it. Kaylin turned. He looked down at the pup in his arms and then at Saoirse, and his face had changed again. The wreckage of the doorway was gone. The man who had wept on his knees in the mud had been put away somewhere deep, and somewhere she could not reach. What stood in front of her now was the king the bard sang about, the black wolf of the drowned crown. The man who had once, by his own hand, ended a war in a single afternoon by walking unarmed into an enemy camp and walking out alone. She had loved that man too. She had loved every version of him. That was, perhaps, what frightened her most. "Saoirse," he said, "do not." The word came out harder than she meant. She had not meant to speak at all. She had meant to stand quietly and let her mind catch up with the impossible morning, but her mouth had moved before her thinking had, and the word that had come was "do not." And once she had said it, she could not call it back. He waited. "Do not say my name like that," she said. "Not like you have a right to it. Not after." He did not flinch. He had never been a man who flinched. But something in his eyes shifted, and she saw with an awful precision that she had hurt him. She told herself she did not care. The pup, in his arms, made a soft, anxious sound, and Kaelin looked down at the child, and the line of his jaw softened, and Saoirse watched him struggle visibly to push down whatever had risen in him, because the small life pressed against his chest needed a steady hand more than a wounded one. He set the pup gently on the rug by the hearth. He did it the way a man diffuses a thing that might break. He knelt, and he laid the pup down, and he ran one large palm along the small silver back from neck to tail in a single slow stroke. And he murmured something low and wordless that the pup answered with a thump of his tail against the floor. Then Kaelin rose, and he turned to her, and he said, "Your shoulder is bleeding." She looked down. She had not noticed. She had been too full of the morning to notice, but her dress at the back of her left shoulder where the old mark sat had begun to stain darker. Not red. Darker than red. The color of wine spilled into deep water. The mark had not bled in 2 years. It had not bled since the night she had run. Saoirse pressed her hand to it through the fabric and felt the heat. Real heat. The kind that did not belong in human skin. "It is nothing," she said. Saoirse. I said do not. "It is bleeding," he said again, and his voice was very level, "because you are within 20 paces of me. The bond has been starving for 2 years. You have been starving it. It is the only reason it has not killed you." She stared at him. "You knew," she said. "You knew where I was. All this time, you knew." "No," he said. "I did not." "Then how?" "He found you." He nodded toward the pup at the hearth. "He pulled the bond after you. He has been pulling it since the night he was born. We did not know what he was doing. We thought he was simply restless. The healers told us pups do not fix on their mothers like that. Not so young, not so strongly. We were told it was a phase. I did not understand until last week, when he slipped his nurse and ran for the eastern wood, and I felt the thread go taut, and I felt it pull toward something, and I followed because that thread was the only living thing left in me." He paused. He did not look away from her. "He came to find his mother," Kaelin said. "That is what he did. He came to find you, and the bond led him here, because the bond knows where you are, even when you do not know where you are." The room was very quiet. The pup at the hearth had laid his small head down on his paws and closed his eyes, exhausted, finally, into the kind of sleep that only comes when a creature is at last in the place it was made to be. Saoirse looked at the small silver shape, and something in her chest, something she had walled off 2 years ago with mortar made of grief and rage, began, slowly, to crack. "I did not bear him," she whispered. "You did. I did not." "Saoirse." His voice softened. He took one step toward her and stopped, the way a man stops when he is approaching a wounded animal who might bolt. "What is the last night you remember? Before the morning you ran. The last full night." She did not want to think about it. She had spent 2 years not thinking about it. She thought about it. "The harvest fire," she said slowly. "There was a feast. The wine was cold. You—" Her voice caught. She steadied it. "You laughed. I had not seen you laugh in weeks. You laughed at something the cook's boy said, and you put your hand on the back of my neck under the table, and I thought." She stopped. She did not finish. "And then?" Kaylin asked quietly. "And then I woke." "When?" "In the morning." "Which morning?" "The next morning." He did not say anything. He waited. He waited the way he had waited at the door, with the patience of a man who has lived long enough to know that the truth is rarely something you ask for. It is something you sit beside until it walks up to you of its own accord. Sayers opened her mouth to say the next morning and stopped. Her throat closed, because she had said the next morning in her own head 1,000 times, and it had always been the next morning. Of course it had been the next morning. What other morning could it have been? Except that now, with him standing in front of her, and the pup asleep at her feet, and the mark on her shoulder bleeding through her dress, she was suddenly not sure. She tried to count. She tried to count the days between the harvest fire and the morning she had woken. She could not. There was no count. There was the fire, and there was the morning, and between them was a flat gray nothing, the kind of nothing that a person never notices because nothings are not things one notices. She had not noticed because there had been nothing to notice. Or there had been nothing to notice because someone had made very sure she would not. The mark on her shoulder pulsed. Cersei's hand went to her mouth. "Kaylin," she whispered. "Yes," he said. "Kaylin, what happened to me?" He closed the distance between them. He did not touch her. He stopped close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him through the rain-damp wool of his cloak, and he looked down at her with the gold in his eyes banked into something quieter and older than rage. "That," he said, "is what I have spent 2 years trying to learn." The latch clicked behind him. The door opened a careful hand's breadth, and the courteous voice said, "My king, we have one alive." Kaylin did not break her gaze. "Bring him," he said. They did not bring him into the cottage. Whatever mercy was left in Kaylin that morning, he chose to spend it on her hearth. He would not have a man bleed on the floor where her pup lay sleeping. He stepped outside instead, into the rain that had thinned now to a gray drizzle, and Saoirse, after a single unsteady breath, gathered the wool blanket from her bed and wrapped it around her shoulders and followed him. 2 of the men she had not yet seen had a third man on his knees in the mud. The captive was younger than she had expected. He could not have been much past 20. His hood had been pulled back, and his hair, plastered dark against his skull, was the color of wet wheat. His mouth was cut, and one of his eyes was already beginning to swell, and his hands were bound behind him with a leather cord that looked as if it had been pulled cruelly tight. He was not weeping. He was not begging. He was looking at the ground in front of his knees with the particular blankness of a man who knew he was already dead and was only waiting to learn the shape of it. Kaylin crossed the yard. Saoirse stayed near the cottage door, one hand against the wood. The pup pressed warm against her ankles where he had woken and padded out behind her. "Look at me," Kaylin said. The young man did not. The beta, the one called Ronan, stepped forward and took the captive by the chin and lifted his head. Ronan was older than the others, his face long and lined, his beard a careful gray. He moved with the unhurried economy of a man who had been a beta for longer than the king had been a king. He did not look unkind. He looked like a man who had stopped finding cruelty interesting a very long time ago. Kaylin crouched until his face was level with the young man's. "Whose are you?" he asked. The captive said nothing. "You wear no sigil," Kaylin said. "Your cloak has been stripped. Your boots are good leather, but the stitching is southern. You have been on the road 8 days at least, by the wear on your sleeves. You did not come from the high country. You came from the coast. And you came on orders. And the orders were to follow a wolf pup until he led you to a woman." The young man's eyes flickered. He did not mean to let them. They flickered anyway. Kaylin saw it. So did Saoirse. "You found her," Kaylin went on, in the same level voice. "And you did not act. Why? Silence. You did not act, Kaelin said. Because your orders were not to take her. Your orders were to confirm her, and to send word, and to wait for someone else to come. Is that correct? The captive's jaw set. How long? Kaelin asked. Until they arrive? Nothing. Kaelin rose. He did not strike the man. He did not draw a knife. He simply rose, and he stood there for a long moment looking down at the captive in the mud, and Saoirse watched the young man begin, very slowly, to tremble. Not from cold. The trembling came from somewhere deeper, the kind that begins when a person has been told, by no words at all, that the worst thing they have ever imagined is about to happen to them, and that there will be nobody coming to stop it. My king, the young man said. His voice cracked on the word. My king, I was told. I was told only to watch. I did not know the boy was yours. I did not know. I swear by every breath I have left. Whose? The single word finally broke him. Valan, the young man whispered. House Valan of the Salt Court, the Lady Mardis. She has paid us through her steward in Ennicourt. She wanted the boy delivered to her keep before the autumn moon. She said. He stopped. He shook his head, as if the next words were physically caught in his throat. She said the boy carried something that did not belong to him. She said his blood was not his to keep. Kaelin's hand twitched at his side. It was the only sign of what the words had done to him. His hand twitched once, and then went very still, and Saoirse, watching from the doorway, understood that she had just seen the most feared man in 3 kingdoms exercise more self-control than most men exercised in a lifetime. Mardis, he said, almost to himself. He turned. He looked at Saoirse. And the look on his face was, for the briefest instant, not a king's look at all. It was the look of a man who had just been handed a piece of a puzzle he had been carrying broken in his pocket for 2 years, and was now, slowly, fitting the new piece against the others. Saoirse, he said, the harvest fire. Who poured your wine? She did not understand the question at first. Then she did. She remembered. A woman in pale blue. A woman who had laughed gently at her elbow, who had said, Let me. You have been on your feet all night. Drink something cold, who had tilted the pitcher with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. A woman whose hair had been the color of polished wheat. A woman who was Kaelin's cousin. A woman who had been the kindest face at court to her in those last weeks, when the looks of the older women had begun to grow sharp. Saoirse made a sound that was almost a laugh. It was not a laugh. Mardis, she said. Kaelin closed his eyes. For one moment he stood there in the rain with his eyes closed, and Saoirse watched a long, slow breath move through his shoulders, and she understood that he was holding back something so vast that to let any part of it out would have leveled the orchard. When he opened his eyes, they were the color of a forge. How long? He said to the captive. Until they arrive? 2 days, the young man whispered. Perhaps 3. The lady's own riders. 12 of them. She is sending her son. Her son, Kaelin said, very softly. Lochran. The young man nodded. Just once, as if his neck had stopped working. Kaelin turned to Ronan. Hold him in the cellar of the chapel. Feed him. Do not let him die. If the Valens want their messenger back, they will get him back. But not for some time. And not in the condition they sent him. My king. The beta took the captive by the upper arm and lifted him to his feet with a single efficient motion. The young man did not resist. As he was being led past Kaelin, he twisted his head and looked back, and his eyes found Saoirse at the doorway, and what Saoirse saw in them was not malice. It was sorrow. It was the sorrow of a young man who had been told a story about a dangerous woman with stolen blood, and had ridden 8 days to confirm it, and had arrived at her cottage to find a thin, tired healer with a mark on her shoulder that bled in the rain. He looked away. They led him off into the orchard. Saoirse did not realize her hand had gone to her mouth until Kaelin was standing in front of her again, very close, the rain catching in the dark of his hair, his cloak trailing water onto the stone of her threshold. "Mardis is your cousin," she said. She was. She was at court. She poured my wine. She put her hand on my arm. Yes. Why? He was silent for a long moment. Because, he said at last, the night of the harvest fire, you and I were going to announce something, and her brother was the one who would have been displaced by that announcement, and her family has been quietly trying to put a Valen on my throne for 6 generations. Announce what? He looked at her. You do not remember. I do not remember, she said, and she heard the crack in her own voice and could not stop it. Kaelin, I do not remember anything. I remember the fire. I remember your hand. I remember waking up, and you were gone, and there was a letter on my pillow in your handwriting that said you no longer wished to see me, and I packed a bag and I ran, and I have spent 2 years believing every word of it. What was I going to be told that night? What was I never told? He said nothing. He reached out, very slowly, and he took her hand. He turned it over in his and laid it palm up against his own. He pressed his thumb, gently, against the soft skin at the base of her wrist, against the place where her pulse moved, and he held it there until her pulse, and his pulse, beneath his thumb, began to fall into the same long, low rhythm. You were carrying my child, he said quietly, and I had asked you that morning to be my queen. The world went white at the edges. Saoirse did not faint. She did not have the luxury of fainting. She felt her knees begin to buckle, and she felt Kaelin's other hand come up under her elbow, and she felt the small, warm weight of the pup press against her ankle. And somehow, between the 3 of them, the world did not actually finish tilting. I never knew, she whispered. I know. I never knew, Kaelin. I know my heart. The endearment slipped out before either of them was ready for it. She heard it. He heard it. Neither of them acknowledged it. He went on very quietly, almost as if he were speaking to himself. They took the memory of the proposal. They took the memory of the child. They took 11 days of your life and they smoothed the seam shut, and they wrote a letter in my hand, and they put it on your pillow, and they made certain you would run. Then they took the child from your body before you ever knew you carried him, and they raised him in secret in the keep at Ennicourt, and they intended to bring him out at the right hour, in the right court, to claim him as Mardis's own. They intended to use him. Yes. To take your throne. Yes. And me? He looked at her for a long moment. You were to disappear, he said. Quietly, in a village far enough from any of the great roads that no one would ever ask. The Valens are patient. They had 11 months in mind. Some accident with the river, perhaps. Some fever in winter. Mardis had even chosen the woman who would replace you in my chambers when grief drove me to a second bond. Saoirse closed her eyes. She thought of the 2 years she had spent in this cottage. She thought of every night she had lain awake with the mark on her shoulder burning, hating herself for still wanting a man who had cast her away. She thought of the borrowed name, the borrowed cat, the careful, careful smallness of the life she had built so that no one would ever look at her twice. She thought of the pup. She opened her eyes. He found me anyway, she said. Yes. He found me, Kaelin. That little body. He came 9 days through the high country alone. Yes. How? Kaelin looked down at the pup, who was leaning now against his boot, eyes half closed, ear flicking each time the rain dripped from the eaves above. Because the bond between a true mother and a stolen child, Kaelin said, is older and stronger than any spell the Valens have ever paid for. They can take 11 days. They can take 11 months. They cannot take what the blood remembers. He lifted his head. He looked at her again. The gold in his eyes was very steady. And he is not the only one who remembers, Saoirse. She felt the mark on her shoulder pulse, hot and slow, like a second heart waking up after a long sleep. She did not pull her hand from his. They did not have 2 days. That was the first thing Kaelin said when they went back inside the cottage. The drizzle had thickened again, and the orchard road was empty now of everything except hoofprints filling slowly with water, and the pup, exhausted past further fighting, had crawled onto the rug and gone to sleep in a small silver coil that Saoirse could not quite stop watching. Kaelin stood by the hearth. He did not sit. She had the impression that he had not properly sat down in a great many days, perhaps weeks, perhaps not since the night he had ridden out after the boy. "They will come faster than the captive said," he told her. "The captive does not know it. The Lady Mardis will. The moment her watcher fails to send word at his appointed hour, she will know that something has gone wrong, and she will not wait for the autumn moon. She will send Lochran within the day." "Lochran," Saoirse repeated. "Her son. You said his name as if he is a problem on his own, separate from his mother." Kaelin's jaw moved. "He is. Worse than her? Different than her. She is patient. He is not. She wants the throne. He wants the pleasure of taking it. The two of them together are dangerous in ways that only the two of them together can be, because she can make him wait, and he can make her move." Saoirse pressed her hands to her face. She did not weep. She had not yet given herself the luxury of weeping. She held her palms flat against her eyes for the space of 3 breaths, and then she lowered them, and she said, "What do you need me to do?" He looked at her. She had surprised him. He did not show it the way other men would have. There was only a small adjustment in the line of his shoulders, a very slight softening at the corners of his eyes, but she saw it because she had once, in another life, made a study of his face the way other women made a study of music. "I cannot ask you anything," he said quietly. "I am not offering," she said. "I am asking what you need." He did not answer at once. He crossed the small room and crouched again by the pup, and he laid his palm on the silver back and held it there. And the child sighed in his sleep and pushed his small face deeper into the wool. "I need," Kaelin said, "for you and the boy to be moved before nightfall. Not to my keep. Mardis will expect that. Not to any of my holdings. There is a place. A house in the marshes. It is not on any map that the Salt Court has access to. Ronan can have you there by dusk if we ride hard. I will stay behind with 3 men and meet Lochran on this road. He will not pass. You will fight him here." "Yes. At my cottage." "Saoirse. You will fight him here, in my orchard, alone, with 3 men, while a lady's son comes down on you with 12. "Yes." She was already shaking her head. "No. Saoirse." "No, Kaelin. Do not say my name like that. Do not use that voice on me. I am not one of your guard, no. You will not stand alone at my door for me. It is not for you. Do not lie to me." He went still. The whole of him went still, in the way that only he could go still, and Saoirse, whose hands had been moving in the air without her permission, slowly let them drop. "It is for the boy," Kaelin said very quietly. "It is for you. It is for the years they took from us. It is for every night I lay awake in a cold bed certain that you had stopped loving me. And it is for every night you lay awake in this cottage certain that I had stopped loving you. And it is for the 11 days they cut out of your life. And it is for the proposal you never heard. And it is for the child they tried to grow in a stranger's arms. So yes, Saoirse, I will stand alone at your door. I have wanted to stand at your door for 2 years, and I will not move from it now." She could not breathe for a moment. She turned her face away. She turned it toward the fire. She watched the flames work along a piece of pine until she trusted herself to speak. "Then I am not going to the Marsh house," she said. He drew breath to argue. "I am not going to the Marsh house," she said again quietly, before he could begin. "Because if Lochran Valen comes through that orchard with 12 men, you will need more than 3 at your back, and I am not going to sit on a wet road 30 miles from here and wait to learn whether you have lived. I am going with you to the village. I am going to the chapel. I am going to ask the men of Hollowmere whether any of them owe me a debt. And there are 7 who do, and 4 of those 7 were soldiers in their younger years. And if I ask them, they will come. Saoirse. And I am going to ride to the miller, and I am going to tell him what he did when he told a stranger where I lived, and I am going to ask him for the loan of his 2 sons, and the long bow that hangs above his hearth that he claims he keeps for sentimental reasons, but that I have seen him oil twice a season for 10 years. Saoirse. And if any of them refuse, I will go without them. But they will not refuse. Caelan, because I have set their bones and birthed their children, and I have not asked one favor of any of them in 2 years, and the day I ask, they will come." She turned to him. Her eyes were wet. She did not bother to hide it. "The boy stays with us," she said. "I am not letting him out of my sight. Not now. Not after he came 9 days through the high country alone. He sleeps where I sleep, and he rides where I ride. And if Lochran Valen wants him, he goes through me first, and through you second, and through every man of Hollowmere I can put between his sword and that small silver back." Caelan looked at her for a long, long moment. Then, slowly, he crossed the room. He stopped in front of her, close, closer than he had stood since the doorway, and he reached up with both hands and he cupped her face the way she had once watched him cup the head of a newborn foal he had been the first man in the world to touch. He did not kiss her. She thought he might. She thought for a single suspended heartbeat that he was going to, and she did not know what she would have done if he had. But he did not. He lowered his forehead, instead, to hers. He rested it there. He breathed. "You are going to ruin me," he said. "You are going to walk back into my life and stand at my shoulder with a borrowed bow and ruin every wall I have built in 2 years." "Good," she whispered. "Good," he agreed. The pup, on the rug, made a small sleeping sound that was almost a laugh. They stayed like that. A long moment. Long enough that Saoirse began to learn, again, the rhythm of his breathing. Long enough that her hand, of its own accord, came up and laid itself flat against the front of his cloak, against the place where his heart was. The mark on her shoulder did not burn. It glowed. She felt it. Through the fabric, through the dressing she had not yet had time to put on it, the bleeding had stopped, and the heat had become something else. Something quiet and warm and insistent, the way a banked coal is warm. She had not felt that in 2 years. She had forgotten she was capable of it. Caelan lifted his head. "Get your cloak," he said. She did. She did not pack much. She had spent 2 years rehearsing the leaving of this cottage, and now that the moment had come, she could not bring herself to take the things she had once promised herself she would. She did not take the borrowed cat's bowl. She did not take the lavender from the rafters. She took her grandmother's mortar and a packet of dried yarrow and the small silver ring she had hidden under the floorboard beneath her bed, the one Caelan had given her on a midsummer evening long before the world had broken, the one she had pretended for 2 years she had thrown into the river. The pup woke when she lifted him. He blinked up at her with the honey eyes, and he made a small sound, and she pressed her face into his fur for one selfish breath, and she said, very quietly, "Hello, little one. I am sorry. I am sorry, I did not know." He pushed his nose against her jaw. She thought, "I will tell him my real name." She thought, He should have heard it from me first. But she did not tell him yet. There would be time. There had to be time. There would be time. Because she was going to make there be time. And that was a thing she had not let herself believe for 2 whole years. They went out into the rain together. The orchard road was empty. Ronan and the second guard had vanished into the trees. Kalen helped her into the saddle of his own horse, the great black who had carried him through 4 sleepless days, and the pup he tucked into a sling against his own chest, the way fathers in the high country had carried children since long before there had been kings. The horse turned toward Hollowmere. They had ridden perhaps 200 paces when the third guard came out of the trees ahead at a hard canter, his face white under the hood, and he reined in so sharply that his horse half reared, and Saoirse felt Kaelin's body go rigid behind her in the saddle. "My king," the guard said. "How many?" "Not on the orchard road." "Then where?" "The chapel," the guard said. "The chapel and the bridge, both." They came in from the west. "They are already inside the village." Saoirse felt Kaelin's arm tighten across her waist. "How many?" he said again. The guard swallowed. "My king," he said. "It is not Lochran." "Then who?" The guard's eyes flicked just once to Saoirse, and there was something in them that she recognized. Something she had seen in the faces of men who had come to her cottage with bad news about somebody's child, and she felt the bottom of her stomach drop out of her body before he had said the next word. "My king," he said quietly. "It is the Lady Mardise herself. She has come in person, and she is standing in the square of Hollowmere with her hand on the shoulder of the miller, and she is asking, by name, for the woman who lives in the cottage at the edge of the wood." The pup, against Kaelin's chest, lifted his head. He bared his small white teeth for the first time since Saoirse had pulled him from her threshold, and a low, impossible sound came out of him, the sound a pup his age should not yet have been able to make. The sound of a wolf who had recognized the scent of the woman who had stolen him from his mother's body. Saoirse looked over her shoulder into the gold of Kaelin's eyes. "Then we do not go to the chapel," she said. "We go to the square." He held her gaze. He held it for a long, slow heartbeat in the drizzling rain. And then the most feared man in 3 kingdoms did the one thing the bards had never written a song about. He smiled. The square of Hollowmere was the smallest square in any village Saoirse had ever lived in. It was not truly a square at all. It was a place where 4 lanes met by accident, where a stone well stood in the middle because someone 200 years ago had decided that water should be drawn from there, where the chapel faced the smithy and the smithy faced the inn, and the inn faced the long wall of the miller's storehouse. There were no banners. There was no fountain. There was, on most mornings, a chicken or 2 pecking at the wet stones, and an old man on the bench by the well who had outlived 3 wives and could tell you the name of every dog in the village. The old man was not on his bench. The chickens were gone. Saoirse saw the village before the village saw her. Kaelin had drawn the black horse to a halt at the bend in the road, where the orchard fell away and the rooftops began. And from there, through the thinning rain, she could see straight down the lane into the square, and the square was full of strangers. There were perhaps 15 of them. They wore traveling cloaks of a dull, expensive gray, the color of slate, the color of a sky before snow. They did not wear sigils. They did not need to. Their horses, tethered in a tidy line outside the inn, were the kind of horses that belonged to people who did not need to announce themselves. Their hands, where she could see them, rested on hilts. The villagers had been gathered in front of the chapel. Not roughly. That was the part that turned Saoirse's stomach. They had not been driven there at sword point. They had been invited. Standing closest to the well was the miller, and beside him stood the miller's wife. And the woman who had her hand on the miller's shoulder was so composed, so gentle, so apparently sympathetic, that for one disorienting moment Saoirse could not understand why everyone in the square was not laughing. The Lady Mardis Valen was beautiful. Saoirse had forgotten that, somehow, in 2 years. She had remembered the pale blue dress and the wheat-colored hair and the smile, but she had not remembered that Mardis was beautiful in the way a knife is beautiful, with the same cleanness, the same balance, the same quiet promise that you would not feel the cut until the cut had already been made. "Stop here," Kaelin said. It was not to her. It was to the third guard who had ridden up alongside them. The man reined in at once. "Find Ronan," Kaelin said. "The captive can wait. Have one of the men guard him. Tell him to bring every man he can find to the eastern lane, but not to enter the square until I lift my hand. Ride." The guard rode. Saoirse turned in the saddle. She looked up at Kaelin. The rain had fined down to a mist now, and there were beads of it caught in his hair, in his lashes, in the dark of his beard, and his face was set in the particular stillness she had seen earlier in the cottage, the stillness of a man choosing deliberately not to strike. "You are about to do something foolish," she said. "I am about to do something necessary." "Those are not always the same thing." He looked down at her. The gold in his eyes had banked very low. "Saoirse," he said, "she is holding the village with kindness. I have seen this. She will keep holding them with kindness until she is no longer required to. The moment she sees me, the kindness will end. And the moment the kindness ends, every soul in that square will be a hostage. I cannot ride into the lane. I have to walk in, alone, on foot, with the boy." "With the boy?" she repeated. "She wants to see him. I will let her see him. She will not strike at a child she has spent 2 years cultivating. She will speak first. She always speaks first. While she speaks, you will move along the back of the storehouse with the bough we are about to borrow from the miller's hearth, and you will get behind her men, and you will wait for my hand." "Kaelin, yes. If she sees me before she sees the boy, she will know. I know. I cannot hide my face. She knew me at court. She knew me in the kitchens. She will recognize the shape of me from 100 paces." "Yes," he said, "which is why she will not see you until it is too late." He swung his leg over the saddle and dropped to the ground in a single fluid motion that did not jar the pup against his chest. He reached up. He lifted her down with both hands at her waist. He set her on her feet in the wet grass, and his hands stayed there a moment longer than they needed to, and Saoirse felt the warmth of them through the wool of her dress, and the warmth of her own mark answering them through her skin, and she thought, "If we live through the next hour, I am never going to let this man further than the next room from me again." Kaelin turned his head toward the village. He whistled, once, very low. For a long moment nothing answered. Then, from the alley behind the smithy, a small dark shape detached itself, and came at a careful run along the back of the storehouse wall, keeping low, keeping silent. And Saoirse realized that one of the riders had never been with them in the orchard at all. He had been in the village the entire morning, ahead of them, watching. "My king," the rider said, when he had reached the bend in the road. He was very young, no older than Lochran's captive had been, but his eyes were old. "Tell me." 12 at the well. 2 on the inn roof with crossbows. The lady has the miller and his wife in front of her, and the rest of the villagers are gathered, but they are not bound. She has been speaking to them for nearly an hour. She has told them that a dangerous woman has been living among them. She has told them that the woman has stolen something belonging to her. She has offered the village a great deal of silver if the woman is brought to her unharmed. Saoirse felt her stomach turn over. "Has anyone gone for her?" Kaelin asked. The young rider hesitated. "My king," he said, "no one has moved. The miller has been crying. He has been telling her she is mistaken." The miller's wife slapped a man who reached for the silver. Saoirse pressed her hand to her mouth. Good people, Kaelin said quietly. Good people, your village. She could not answer. Her throat had closed. Bow, Kaelin said to the young rider. From the miller's house. Tell his wife it is for the woman she has been protecting. She will give it to you. The rider was already moving. Kaelin turned to Saoirse. He lifted the pup, very gently, out of the sling at his chest. He did not give the boy to her. He held him up between them, the small silver body warm and awake, the honey eyes moving from his father's face to his mother's, slow and grave and entirely unsurprised by anything that was happening. Listen to me, Kaelin said softly, and Saoirse did not know, at first, whether he was speaking to her or to the child. Then she realized he was speaking to both. There is a woman in that square, he said, who took 11 days from your mother and 9 months from your life. She did it cleverly. She did it kindly. She did it with smiles and with wine and with hands on shoulders. And she would have taken everything else in time if you had not been brave enough to walk 9 days through the high country to find the woman who bore you. The pup made a small sound. You are not going to look at her, Kaelin said. You are going to look at me, the whole time. Your mother is going to be doing something brave behind her, and your job is not to give her away. So your eyes stay on mine. Can you do that, little one? The pup pushed his nose against Kaelin's jaw. Good boy, Kaelin whispered. He brought the pup against his shoulder. He turned. He looked at Saoirse, and the look had in it everything they had not had 2 years to say. If anything happens to me, he began. No, she said. Saoirse. No, Kaelin. I am not letting you say it. I am not going to carry that sentence into the square with me. Do not give it to me. Hold it. We will say it tonight. We will say all of it tonight, when this is done, and the boy is asleep, and there is bread on the table, tonight. He looked at her. He did not finish the sentence. He bent his head instead, and he pressed his mouth to her forehead, and the kiss was very long and very still, and the rain misted gently down on them, and the pup, between them, sighed. Tonight, Kaelin agreed. They went into the village separately. Saoirse cut behind the smithy, the long bow heavy and unfamiliar across her back. 3 of the miller's arrows clenched in her left hand because the quiver had been too rotted to trust. She moved the way she had taught herself to move in the woods around her cottage, slow and low and breathing through her mouth. And she did not let herself think about Kaelin walking down the lane alone, his cloak thrown back, his head bare to the rain, the small silver pup held high against his chest where every soul in the square would see him. She heard the silence fall. She heard it from behind the storehouse wall, the way a bird hears a hawk, by the sudden absence of every other sound. The villagers had stopped weeping. The strangers had stopped shifting. Somewhere on the inn roof, a crossbow had been lowered and then carefully not lowered the rest of the way. She slid the long bow from her shoulder. She set the first arrow against the string. She did not pray. She had stopped praying 2 years ago. Instead, she did the thing her grandmother had taught her to do in moments of fear, which was to count. She counted backward from 12, slowly, the way her grandmother had counted off the stitches of a difficult mend, and by the time she reached one, her hands had stopped shaking, and the bow felt as if it had always been hers, and she stepped, very quietly, around the corner of the storehouse. Mardis was speaking. A tragedy, she was saying, in the gentle, polished voice Saoirse had heard pour wine into a silver cup at a harvest fire 2 years ago. I do not blame you. I know you have come to love her. She has a way. She has always had a way. But the child she has hidden from the world is not hers, my friends. The child is mine. The child belongs to my house, and to my keep, and to the future of this realm, and a woman who would steal a noble child from his cradle and raise him in a peasant cottage at the edge of a wood is not the gentle healer you believe her to be. She is sick. She needs care. We are here to give her that care. She had not seen Kaelin yet. Her men had. Saoirse saw the ripple move through the gray cloaks at the well, saw heads turn one by one, saw a hand drift toward a sword and stop. Mardis, oblivious, kept speaking. It was Kaelin who broke her sentence. He did not raise his voice. He never had to. He simply spoke, from the mouth of the lane, and his voice carried the way the voice of a great bell carries. Mardis, he said. Cousin. She froze. For a single instant before she turned, the most composed woman Saoirse had ever known became a statue, and Saoirse, with the bow drawn and her arrow held steady on the man with the crossbow on the inn roof, watched the statue's hand tighten, just a little, on the miller's shoulder. Mardis turned. She turned with grace, because she was a woman who had been trained from the cradle to turn with grace, and she smiled, because she was a woman who had been trained from the cradle to smile, and the smile arrived on her mouth a beat too late, and Saoirse, behind the storehouse wall with the rain in her eyes, saw that beat, and so did Kaelin, and so did every man at the well who had served Mardis long enough to know what that beat meant. My king, Mardis said. Cousin. You have come a long way. You have come further. She did not answer. He took one step into the square. The pup, against his shoulder, did not look at her. He kept his eyes on Kaelin's jaw, the way he had been told, and Saoirse felt, in her own chest, the small, fierce pride of a mother whose child had remembered a difficult instruction at a very dangerous moment. You found him, Mardis said. He found me, Kaelin said. He found his mother first. Then he found me. We had quite a walk, the three of us. The miller's wife made a sound. It was a small sound, almost a laugh, almost a sob. Mardis's hand on the miller's shoulder went white at the knuckles. My king, she said, more carefully now. You are tired. You have ridden far. The boy is mine. It was mine. The story you have been told is not the story that happened. If we may sit, in the inn, in private, I can... You poured her wine, Kaelin said. The square went still. At the harvest fire, he said, pale blue dress. You said, let me. You have been on your feet all night. You poured her wine. The wine carried something that took 11 days from her. While she was sleeping in your care, you took the child from her body. You raised the child as your own. You wrote a letter in my hand, on my paper, sealed with my seal, and you put it on her pillow, and you made her run. Mardis's smile did not slip. It became, instead, very thin. You cannot prove a single word of that, she said softly. I do not need to prove it, Kaelin said. Your messenger did. He sang it in my beta's hands like a boy at a hearth feast. His name is Ulrich, and he is the second son of the harbor master at Ennicour. And he has been working for your steward for 8 days, and he has told us a great many things you would prefer he had not. He is currently in the cellar of the chapel of Hollowmere, eating bread he has not earned, and he is going to tell the assembled High Council exactly what he told us. For the first time, Mardis's composure broke. It did not break the way Saoirse had imagined it would. It broke very small. A muscle moved in her cheek. Her eyes flicked once to the inn roof, where the crossbowman was waiting for her sign, and Saoirse, who had been waiting for that flick for the entire conversation, breathed out very slowly and let her arrow fly. The crossbowman fell forward off the roof and did not land standing. The square exploded. What happened next would, in years to come, be told and retold in the Inn of Hollowmere with various embellishments, none of which would be quite true, because nothing about what actually happened in those minutes was simple enough to fit into the shape of a story. Saoirse would remember it in pieces. She would remember loosing the second arrow at the man who lunged for the miller's wife. She would remember the third arrow snapping in her hand because the wood was old, and her cursing softly and dropping the bow and drawing the small silver knife from her belt without quite knowing she had done it. She would remember Kaelin. She would remember Kaelin setting the pup very gently on the chapel step and turning and becoming something the bards had never quite managed to describe because the bards had only ever heard about him at second hand. She would remember the way the gray-cloaked men had hesitated when they saw what was walking toward them, and the way they had hesitated had cost them, because Kaelin had used the hesitation, and Ronan and the others had come up the eastern lane behind him by then, and the math in the square had become very sudden and very cruel. She would remember Mardis running. Mardis, who had never run from anything in her life, had picked up her gray skirts and run, not toward her horses, but toward the chapel, toward the steps, toward the small silver pup who sat exactly where his father had set him, watching. Saoirse would remember seeing this, and she would remember knowing, with a clarity she had not had in 2 years, what she was about to do. She did not call out. She did not warn. She put herself between Mardis and the pup, and when Mardis came up the steps with a small jeweled knife in her hand and murder in her eyes, Saoirse caught the wrist that held the knife in her left hand, and she drove her right palm flat into the woman's throat, and as Mardis staggered back, gasping, Saoirse said, very quietly, the first sentence she had spoken aloud in 2 years using her real name. "My name," she said, "is Saoirse Brenhin of the Hollow Hills, and that is my son." Mardis fell to her knees on the chapel step. She did not get up. The square went quiet again, slowly, the way a forest goes quiet after a great wind has passed. Kaelin was already on the step, his hands closed around Saoirse's shoulders from behind. She could feel him shaking. She could feel the pup pressed against her thigh, his small silver head turned up to her face, the honey eyes wide and bright. "Saoirse Brennan of the Hollow Hills," Kaelin murmured behind her ear. "It is the name my mother gave me. I know it. I have known it for 9 years. I have not heard it spoken in 2. I will speak it," he said, "every morning for the rest of your life, if you will let me." She closed her eyes. The mark on her shoulder was no longer burning. It was no longer glowing. It was simply warm, the way a hand that has been held for a long time is warm, and she understood, standing on the chapel step in the thinning rain, with her son leaning against her leg, that the bond she had spent 2 years trying to starve to death had not died. It had only been waiting. She turned in his arms. She lifted her face. She kissed him. It was not a long kiss. It was not a beautiful kiss in the way the bards would later sing it. Her lip was split from the woman who had fallen, and his hands were still trembling, and the pup made an indignant sound between their knees, and somewhere behind them Ronan was shouting orders about the binding of prisoners, and the miller's wife was weeping into her apron, and the rain was beginning, at last, to lift. But in the kiss was every word neither of them had been allowed to say for 2 years, and that was enough. That night, in the back room of the chapel, with the boy asleep on a borrowed cot between them, Kaelin completed the bond. There was no ceremony. There were no witnesses. There was only Saoirse, sitting on the edge of the cot in a borrowed shift with her hair down, and Kaelin kneeling on the floor in front of her, and the mark on her shoulder, which she had bared for him, soft and silver, and breathing under his fingertips. He did not bite her. That was not the way of it. Not for them. Not after everything. He pressed his mouth, instead, to the mark, and he held it there, and he breathed. And Saoirse felt the bond complete itself the way a circuit closes, the way a door long stuck finally opens, the way a held breath is finally let out. She wept. She did not know how long she wept. She knew only that when she opened her eyes again, his head was in her lap, and his arms were around her waist, and the boy on the cot had crawled across in his sleep and was pressed against her hip, and the 3 of them were for the first time in 2 years and 7 months and 12 days, in the same place at the same time, breathing the same air, alive. Kaelin looked up at her. "Tonight," he said. "Tonight," she agreed. In the years that followed, the Lady Mardis Velan was tried before the High Council of the Drowned Crown for the abduction of an heir, the use of forbidden drafts upon the body of a noblewoman, and the forging of the king's own hand. She was found guilty on every count. She was not executed. Kaelin, who had every right to take her head, chose instead a punishment that the bards found less satisfying, but that Saoirse, who had thought about it for many long nights, found more just. Mardis was stripped of her name and her house, and given a small cottage at the edge of a wood, and sentenced to live alone there for the rest of her natural life, healing the small ailments of the village around her, under whatever borrowed name she could earn. Lochran Velan was not so fortunate. He chose, when his men came for him, to draw his sword. The bards do sing of that. Hollowmere was given a new well, paid for by the king, and the miller was given a horse, and the miller's wife was given a chain of office she did not particularly want. And the old man on the bench by the well lived 3 more years and named every dog in the village twice over before he finally laid himself down to sleep. The boy grew. His name, Saoirse and Kaelin agreed, would be Taran, after Saoirse's grandfather, who had been a quiet man and a good one. Taran of the Drowned Crown, heir to a kingdom and a long list of titles, and also, when he was 4 years old, the small silver wolf who would creep out of the royal apartments in the middle of the night and curl up at the foot of his mother's bed and refuse, with patient stubbornness, to be carried back to his own. Saoirse never made him go. She had given up by then on the project of pretending she did not need her son near her. She had given up on a great many such projects. She slept, most nights, with one hand in Kaelin's and the other resting on the small warm back of her boy, and on the very best nights, with the bond humming quietly in her shoulder and the rain falling on the roof of the king's chamber, she could almost believe that there had never been 2 years at all. Almost. The 2 years had happened. They would always have happened. But the thing about a bond, Saoirse came to understand, was that it did not erase what had been done. It simply outlasted it. It simply held on, through poison and through forgery, and through 11 stolen days and 9 days of high country and 1 cold, shivering pup at a cottage door in a storm. It held on. That, in the end, was the only song the bards never quite managed to write. But Saoirse knew it, and Kaelin knew it, and Taran, who was small still, but who would one day be a king, was learning it. That was enough.